Ontario just flipped the switch. 45 minutes ago, Canada imposed a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to the United States, directly targeting 1.5 million American homes and businesses in New York, Minnesota, and Michigan. This is not a negotiation. This is retaliation, and the timing could not be worse. Winter is ending, but peak demand season is approaching, and the cities that depend most heavily on Canadian hydroelectric power, New York and Boston, are now facing price shocks their grids were never designed to handle. Premier Doug Ford made his position clear. He will not hesitate to increase the charge, and if the United States escalates, he will not hesitate to shut the electricity off completely. Energy has been weaponized, and millions of Americans are about to pay the price. The announcement landed without warning. Ontario Premier Doug Ford stood before cameras and declared that effective immediately, every kilowatt of electricity crossing the border into the United States would cost 25% more. The surcharge applies to 3 states directly, New York, Minnesota, and Michigan, but the impact extends far beyond those borders. Ontario's electricity is often resold to other states through regional grids, and when those prices rise, entire networks feel the pressure. New York imported 7.7 terawatt hours of Canadian electricity in 2024, more than any other state, valued at hundreds of millions of dollars annually. That power doesn't just supplement the grid, it stabilizes it during peak demand periods when local generation cannot meet consumption. Now, every megawatt flowing south carries a 25% premium, and that cost gets passed directly to consumers, already struggling with inflation across multiple sectors. Ford's statement was blunt and unambiguous. He said he would not hesitate to increase the charge if necessary, and if the United States escalates, he would not hesitate to shut the electricity off completely. This was not posturing. This was policy, backed by legislative authority and implemented through Ontario's independent electricity system operator. Stephen Lecce, Ontario's Minister of Energy and Electrification, reinforced the message by stating that the United States needs Canada's power. That dependency is not rhetorical, it is structural. The northeastern United States relies heavily on Canadian hydroelectric generation, particularly during winter heating demands and summer cooling peaks, when local fossil fuel plants struggle to meet load requirements. Quebec and Ontario together provide critical baseload power that keeps lights on and industries running across New York and New England. That integration, built over decades through billions in cross-border infrastructure investment, has now become a vulnerability that politicians can exploit. The surcharge generates between 300,000 and 400,000 Canadian dollars per day, approximately 210,000 to 280,000 US dollars. Ontario's government stated this revenue will support Ontario workers, families, and businesses affected by American tariffs. Ford estimated the surcharge would add approximately 100 Canadian dollars per month to the bills of each American household affected. That figure assumes stable consumption patterns, but electricity markets do not work that way. When supply costs spike, utilities adjust pricing across entire rate structures, and those adjustments compound through distribution charges, capacity fees, and regulatory cost recovery mechanisms. A 25% increase at the import level can translate into 15 to 20% higher bills for end consumers once all factors get calculated. For a household paying $150 monthly for electricity, that means an additional $22 to $30 every month for as long as the surcharge remains in place. Grid operators in New York and New England had been preparing for exactly this scenario, not because Ontario acted first, but because President Donald Trump announced tariffs on imports, including a 10% duty on energy and energy resources. Both the New York Independent System Operator and ISO New England filed emergency proposals with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in February. These filings requested authority to collect potential import duties on Canadian electricity if directed by federal authorities. Both grid operators emphasized that they believe there are strong legal arguments that electricity should not be subject to tariffs and that they should not be responsible for collecting them. But uncertainty required preparation. ISO New England stated that Canadian electricity imports served approximately 11% of New England's load over the past 5 years. The grid operator estimated that a 10 to 25% tariff could amount to between $66 million and $165 million annually, and that cost would be passed to consumers through standard rate adjustment mechanisms. The New York Independent System Operator noted that it is interconnected with Ontario's Independent Electricity System Operator and Hydro-Quebec, allowing imports of up to 4,600 megawatts. That capacity represents a significant portion of New York's peak demand capability, particularly during extreme weather events when local generation faces stress. The United States and Canada, according to NYISO, share one of the most integrated international electric grids in the world. That integration enables reliability and cost efficiency that benefits both nations. Utilities can balance supply and demand across borders, drawing power from wherever generation is cheapest or most available at any given moment. During summer heat waves, Canadian hydroelectric plants provide clean baseload power, while American natural gas plants ramp up for peak cooling demand. During winter cold snaps, the flow sometimes reverses as heating loads surge across both countries. This system works because it is cooperative, predictable, and operates on long-term contracts designed to insulate consumers from sudden price volatility. Ontario's surcharge destroys that predictability. President Trump imposed 25% tariffs on most Canadian goods after a one-month pause, while energy resources faced a 10% duty. Canada responded with its own 25% retaliatory tariffs on 30 billion Canadian dollars worth of United States imports, including dairy products, beverages, plastics, steel, and aircraft parts. The tariff cycle had been escalating for weeks, but until Ontario's announcement, electricity remained relatively insulated from the trade war. That insulation just shattered. Ford's decision escalates the dispute from goods and materials into critical infrastructure, and that shift carries consequences beyond immediate pricing. Energy markets depend on stability. Long-term contracts, capacity planning, and infrastructure investment all require predictable regulatory and pricing environments. When electricity becomes subject to politically driven price shocks, utilities cannot plan effectively. Investors cannot price risk accurately. And consumers absorb the volatility through rate increases that reflect both immediate costs and future uncertainty premiums. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz criticized President Trump sharply, stating that the first victims of Trump's trade war are Minnesotans struggling to pay their skyrocketing electric bills. However, Minnesota Power, the main utility serving the part of Minnesota bordering Ontario, gets only a very small proportion of its power from the province. Minnesota Power bought only about $300,000 worth of electricity from Ontario in 2024 for only 4 months of the year. That limited exposure means Minnesota faces minimal direct impact from Ontario's surcharge. Michigan officials indicated the impact on Michigan customers is likely to be small, as most of Michigan's electricity is produced by in-state utility companies or through long-term contracts. But Matt Helms from the Michigan Public Service Commission expressed concern about grid reliability. He stated that any action to limit or disrupt these flows would remove a layer of protection and make all of us, Canadians and Americans alike, more vulnerable to grid-scale outages. Ford made clear that his surcharge will remain in place despite the 1-month reprieve on vehicle and auto parts tariffs. He said a 1-month pause means nothing but more uncertainty, and added that until these tariffs are off the table and until the threat of tariffs is gone for good, Ontario will not relent. That statement signals this is not a temporary measure subject to quick reversal through diplomatic channels. Ontario views the surcharge as proportional retaliation for American tariffs, and proportional responses do not end until the initial action gets withdrawn. Ford also called on Alberta to impose an export tax on oil. Alberta provides 4.3 million barrels of oil per day to the United States, representing nearly a quarter of all oil America consumes daily. He said if gas prices in the United States rise by $1 per gallon, Americans will lose their minds. That statement was calculated to pressure Washington by threatening even broader energy disruption. But it also reveals how deeply Canadian provincial leaders believe they must respond to defend their economic interests. Quebec announced it is considering similar measures with its electricity exports to the United States. If Quebec follows Ontario's lead, the impact on New England intensifies dramatically. According to Canada's independent electricity system operator, more than half of New York's energy imports from Canada come from Ontario. But New England draws heavily from Quebec's massive hydroelectric infrastructure. Quebec exports significant volumes of clean hydroelectric power to Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. Those exports enable New England states to meet aggressive renewable energy targets and reduce reliance on fossil fuel generation. A 25% surcharge from Quebec would stack on top of Ontario's existing surcharge, compounding costs across the northeastern grid and potentially forcing utilities to activate expensive backup generation sources that drive prices even higher. New York and Boston rely on Canadian hydroelectric power during peak demand periods, especially winter and summer extremes. Temporary price hikes push electricity costs sharply higher, forcing utilities to rely more on natural gas or other expensive alternatives. That cost passes directly to consumers already facing inflation across multiple sectors. Energy analysts and grid operators warned for weeks that current market systems are not designed to handle politically driven price shocks on electricity, and those warnings are now reality. The question is not whether this creates affordability issues for millions of households, but how long the instability persists and whether cross-border power agreements survive intact. On March 11th, 2025, President Trump announced he was doubling tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum to 50%, effective March 12, allegedly in response to Ontario's electricity surcharge. Ford had suspended the electricity surcharge earlier that day, following discussions with United States Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. White House trade advisor Peter Navarro later confirmed that the 50% steel and aluminum tariffs would not proceed after Ford paused the surcharge. But the damage reveals a deeper instability. The pattern is consistent. Tariff announced, retaliation follows, threat escalates, pause negotiated, uncertainty persists. So if Ontario's surcharge was paused once, only to return 45 minutes ago, what happens when the next escalation arrives and neither side blinks? The surcharge is active. The price shock is real. And millions of Americans in New York, Minnesota, and Michigan are about to see their electricity bills climb by double-digit percentages through no fault of their own. This is what trade wars look like when they reach critical infrastructure. Not abstract negotiations over steel quotas or dairy access, but direct threats to shut off power to 1.5 million households. Grid operators scrambling to collect tens of millions of dollars in duties on electricity. States importing essential power suddenly facing 25% price hikes with no alternatives immediately available. The system that took decades to build through cooperation and billions in infrastructure investment is now fragmenting under political pressure, and ordinary citizens absorb the cost while governments exchange tariffs. Doug Ford made his position clear. The surcharge remains until American tariffs are removed completely. Quebec is considering identical measures that would compound the crisis across New England. Alberta holds the ultimate leverage, with 4.3 million barrels of oil per day flowing to the United States. And President Trump continues threatening additional tariffs across multiple sectors. This cycle does not end through statements or temporary pauses. It ends when one side concedes or when the economic damage becomes too severe for both nations to sustain. Energy markets depend on predictability, and tariffs, counter-tariffs, threats, pauses, and reversals create exactly the opposite. Utilities cannot plan. Investors cannot price risk accurately. Consumers pay for the volatility. Ontario's surcharge was paused once before, only to return 45 minutes ago with full force. That pattern tells you everything about where this is heading. Energy is now a weapon, and both sides have demonstrated willingness to use it. The precedent is set. The question is not whether this creates a crisis, but how deep that crisis becomes before either Washington or Ottawa decides the cost is too high. Winter is ending, but summer peak demand is approaching, and the cities most dependent on Canadian hydroelectric power are running out of time to find alternatives that do not exist. If this breakdown exposed the vulnerability hiding behind North America's integrated grid system, hit that like button now. Subscribe and turn on notifications because this situation is escalating rapidly, and the next move could determine whether millions face blackouts or skyrocketing costs. Drop a comment below. Do you think Trump will back down on tariffs, or will Ontario and Quebec follow through on shutting off power completely? Share your take. The energy war just went from threat to reality, and every household in the Northeast needs to understand what is coming next. Tariff announced, retaliation follows, threat escalates, pause negotiated, uncertainty persists. So if Ontario's surcharge was paused once, only to return 45 minutes ago, what happens when the next escalation arrives and neither side blinks?